Hello again, everyone. And so sorry for that disruption. I think that's just what happens when you try to have events like this in this new and very disturbing time that we are in. But in case you didn't catch it the last time, my name is Wale Lawal, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of The Republic, a magazine and platform based in Lagos, Nigeria. And I'll also be moderating the discussion this evening on pushing the African visual identity discourse forward. Today, the evolution and impact of African culture on the world is undeniable. While discourse around ownership, appropriation, and responsibility continue to advance, the dialogue on how to evolve African creative contributions beyond responses to the West and criticism is for many just starting. Featuring pioneers spanning the spaces of fashion, art, and culture, this evening's discussion will focus on the growing global dominance of African identity narratives, including the impact and criticisms of such narratives. We will also explore the ways in which African visual narratives can be propelled forward, especially within the fashion industry. So joining me today are 7 artists and curators. Irene Agbontaen is the founder and creative director of Taller Than Your Average, a London-based brand directly aimed at women who are 5'9" and taller, a gap she had identified in the fashion market. Ladoja is a curator and the creative director of Grey, a Lagos-based fashion brand. Niyi Okuboyejo is a Nigerian-born, Harlem-based fashion designer. He is also the founder of menswear brand Post Imperial. Animashaun is an editor at Native, a music, pop culture, and lifestyle magazine, especially styled for the rise of Afrobeats on the global stage and Africa's metropolitan youth. Stephen Tayo is a Lagos-based photographer who has worked with the New York Times, Vogue, Indie, and Dazed. Tremaine Emery is a designer, cultural creator, and the founder of Denim Tears and the co-founder of No Vacancy Inn. He has worked closely with Kanye West and Virgil Abloh. Yagazi Emezi is an artist and self-taught photojournalist from Aba, Nigeria, focused on stories surrounding African women and their health, sexuality, education, and human rights. The format of this conversation will take place across 4 major themes, looking at what it means to create images and imagery from the continent, what it means to curate those images, criticisms from the continent about how images from Africa are used, and also what it means to think about the future. What is Africa post-representation? And so I'd like to start on the subject of creating images. So Yagazi, as someone who is well known in this field, who has worked with a number of illustrious organizations, what do you think about the idea of African images? Are we still trapped in colonial narratives, in racist narratives, or are spaces emerging for African photographers like yourself to shape narrative?
Thank you, Wale. Glad to hear this question, clearly. I think to start off with, we are definitely far from trapped in that visual narrative. Oh, I think I'm hearing other people on their chats. Just people mute. Okay. So I would definitely say that we are far beyond. Okay, there's still an echo. All right, I think everyone would have muted by now. All right, yes, so to answer your question, I do think that we have moved far beyond being trapped to this visual narrative. Do I think that we have completely moved away from it? No, and that is because the people who carry the majority of these visual narratives are not African. And we are still upcoming in terms of our own publications, in terms of our own platform. And I would say that the African artists, visual artists, storytellers are moving beyond that, are moving more towards like self-representation, if that makes sense. But to just answer the question directly, we're not trapped. The question more so is about who carries these stories. and what power they have over the stories who we're working for. When we say we have worked with so and so publications and magazines, the question is, who are they and how did they guide the work that we gave them?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer, actually. I wanted to just jump off that because, one of the notions that people have nowadays is this idea of the commodification of Blackness. There's a lot of interest in Blackness. And it's very easy as an African creative to become co-opted into that. So I wanted to just, ask this one to Stephen. What do you think? As a photographer, you're in a lot of situations, you're being forced to almost represent a continent. But do you find that there are ways that you can kind of negotiate, or there are ways that you can still kind of put yourself, have your own creative freedom? I think that's kind of what I'm interested in, in hearing from you. You as a photographer, you might be you're working with, brands, for example, like the New York Times, like National Geographic. These are huge institutions. So how does, how do you ensure that your work still represents you? How do you ensure that even when these brands are asking you, which they tend to do sometimes, to further this narrative that Africa is something that can be summarized or represented, how do you still carve your own self within that narrative?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the things I like to always begin every conversations with is that I'm a small portion of somebody who lives in Lagos. Even though I belong to the continent, so I can only represent literally my experiences, and which is very the small portion of Lagos and not even Nigeria as a whole. So I think it's a kind of responsibility I always own on myself to communicate that. So just so we are clear on the issue of representation, because I live in Agbontaen. What happens in Agbontaen might be different from what actually is happening in VI right now. So I think there's a need for people who are interested in consuming stories from Africa to educate themselves as regards, not busking Africa to be just one. That is their responsibility, to be able to differentiate that Lagos is a state in Nigeria. Nigeria is a country in Africa. So as much as we have a responsibility to tell a story, the consumer of this story also have a responsibility to educate themselves as regards, what Africa is and what other spaces exist in Africa.
And let me just piggyback off that, and this is for either you or Yagazi to jump in on. And who do you find those consumers to be? Because I think that's a very important question for us to ask ourselves. We're all in this space producing work, but who is consuming it? And to some extent, of course, consumers get to shape what ends up being produced. But in your experience, who is consuming it? Who is consuming this creative work that comes from the continent? And how does that affect the work that you then end up producing?
I think personally, I've had people say to me that, I haven't been to Africans who haven't been to Africa for the past 30, 20 years. I just saw this story, I can't wait to come back home. And then you see non-Africans saying, oh, wow, there's also a similarity of, what you just shot also in my country. So I think it varies the way you look at who really consume stories. And I also always think it comes from a place of interest, so people are interested in different things, and that also shapes, consumerism, I believe. So it varies sometimes. What do you have to say, Yagazi?
I think I agree. I think consumers vary, but then they are also dependent on what sector of the industry we're talking about. So the consumers in journalism is going to be very different from the consumers in fashion. So consumers in journalism, we can take something as standard as the Washington Post, and we know what our editors want, or we know what the publishers want, but they're thinking about the mass majority of their readership. who still don't know how big Lagos is, who still want things to be simplified and, spoon-fed to them. The same thing with New York Times or all the other bigger publications. So sometimes the responsibility doesn't always lie in the consumers to, to do their research further, because sometimes how do you know to research something you don't know anything about? So where do you even start? So I'm all for putting more responsibility on the actual institutions that a lot of us have benefited from in one way or the other with our careers, or trying to break away from, because they are the ones who are very more than often molded or feeding the consumers. So an example would be, an editor or a writer saying, well, can I put this in the newspaper that says that describes Lagos with skyscrapers and cinemas? My response is, why do you have to put cinemas? Of course we have cinemas in Lagos. It's a mega city. What do you expect? But then her response was, oh, the readers don't know that. But why do we have to simplify it so much? Or why do these certain institutions have to simplify things so much? I think also as creators, it's our responsibility to also not just water down what we know, but also present the complexities of what we do and who we are. And that way it actually garners further curiosity for the consumers, because they're not understanding it. So without understanding it, they can now go to something like Google and say, oh, what does this mean, or what city actually is this, versus the broken down baby food description of something that's far more complex than what is presented. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but the thing I would ask, and I think this is now this is something where it also applies to multiple industries. So if any of the other members of the panelists feel like jumping in, please feel free. But do you then feel like there's a burden on you on you can't just I've spoken to a lot of creative people who sometimes get so wrapped up in the politics of institutions that they don't feel like they have the freedom to just create. I don't want to create stuff that's always going to be political all the time, or I don't want to create something that's always going to have a certain kind of narrative. Do you find that, as an African, photographer, as an African, image maker, as an African fashion designer, there are just these narratives that you just can't break away from? What does that creative freedom then look like?
I think it's a hard mold to break away, because like you said, we have often found ourselves in places where we're boxed in. So you can be that African photographer, or maybe that Nigerian photographer, but never just that photographer, for example. It's something that we'll be carrying on ourselves. But I think it's also important to, and maybe you guys will continue hearing this from me throughout, but I'm all for if you're working under an institution and whatnot, it's important to push back. It's important to say no. And I know Stephen and I have been in this situation before, saying, no, I am not going to create this image that will push this narrative or belief system onto other people. And I think that's also that's where sometimes I think a lot of people encounter fear, is the belief that because maybe we've had an opportunity with XYZ institutions, or if we're branching out on our own and we're looking for opportunities to build, that we have to be a little bit softer and gentler in the way that we push for ourselves. And I am very anti that. So I believe I know that we have the authority in what we know, even if it's that little niche or niche corner in Lagos, or so have you, or in fashion, or in African design, or whatever the case may be. And we can push that, but unfortunately, people get blacklisted, people get labeled as troublemakers, all this other stuff. So easier than done in the long run.
I've personally also requested for so many things from this institution, having a Lagos-based writer write my story, rather than the external eye on us. So it took ages for them to get back to me on confirmation. But then after making the decision, also as a young photographer, and then the second thought of being blacklisted, being too aware of your culture, being too, you want to be in control of your culture. I've had to do this for more than 10 years, I mean, I got like turned down by like 7 of them, saying, "Oh, I don't have to choose who I would like to make the story with." I mean, like I'll always wonder that, you know, if you don't live in Lagos, if you haven't been to Lagos, if you haven't been to the African continent, like if you haven't experienced how things go down here, I think writing about it is a bit too much for anybody who just sits somewhere and, you know, just want to summarize the experience. So I think for me, like, it's always like a constant conversation, as like, you know, I would like to, you know, have this amazing writer who, you know, is respected, who is young, who is vibrant, write the story, you know. And if I'm making like a sports story as well, like there's so many like amazing, like talented writers who live here.
So let me jump in. Let me jump in. Let me just jump in here really quickly, because what you're saying basically then is, then as a photographer, you're not only then thinking about the work that you're doing at that point, you're then also making a curatorial decision, because that's exactly what you're doing. And I don't think that that's something that, you know, as a photographer, I just want to take photos. Like, not that obviously you want to do that in a mindless sense, but you want to have like the luxury of just focusing on that work. But what you're saying is you then enter this position where you're even doing more than what a photographer working in a different environment would be doing, which then even makes me want to, you know, ask the curators in the room, you know, what do you guys think about? What do you guys think about that? You know, from the other perspective, you know, as people who are making these decisions from, you know, on the continent, do you find that these are similar issues that people face? Like when you're curating projects, this is to Joke and Dami, do you find that, you know, it's that these are the similar issues that, or that these are issues that even curators on the continent face as well, where, you know, you're making a decision, but you're not necessarily the best person to be making that decision, or you're making such a huge decision that can actually determine how somebody else's work is perceived? And how does that look like, you know, knowing that, you know, you have this whole Western superstructure that you have to compete against?
For me, I feel like that's my job as a curator, to choose and to talk to the creatives and figure out what they want to communicate. And if it's right for them, then I'm able to curate for that. It's a place of privilege where I'm not the one necessarily creating the work. I'm the one choosing who gets to represent something. And so when I think about curating, I think about the journey within my society that I want to encourage. So I want to encourage Stephen to continue to create what is best for him. I want Niyi to continue to design how he does. And so that's the point where we start from. And it's that continuous journey of also educating these superstructures we're talking about, as Jageze said, where it's like they come to you with an idea and you say, I hear you, I understand what you're saying, but it's probably coming from a place of limited knowledge. And so it's my job to educate you on what you're saying and what the connotations of that idea means. How about we try this? This might even get you more mileage, might be better for your own agenda without having to compromise the integrity of this creative.
Yeah, I think that's an absolute, that's a very, you know, it's a necessary point, because then you're playing this role of, you know, of a kind of middleman, but obviously middlemen get such bad reps. And I wanted to just throw this at Dami. You know, you're working in a publishing space, and obviously Nigeria has so many brilliant writers. There are many brilliant writers out there, but obviously, do you find that, you know, there's a, like when you're looking to pitch to someone, you're looking to commission articles, you're looking to commission pieces, do you find it's easy to do so, or do you find that these artists are more willing or more used to working with Western organizations that have certain expectations? Because my own understanding is, if I'm trying to cover, if as a publishing house, and I've read a couple of native articles which are brilliant, you're going beyond, you know, what other people would expect, like would do, like other platforms that are occupying or trying to cover the same stories would do. Do you find that, you know, when you pitch those ideas, when you try to commission those ideas with writers, there's a reluctance because maybe there's like an easy way out that they would have rather preferred to work with if like a Western, you know, publication was making that commission? Do you find that as a Nigerian brand, you have to go further than most to get like the same stories?
I think, like, luckily for us, we have a very like well-read newsroom. So we have a good team of writers who actually like want to tell the stories as much as we want to, get the stories across. So no, it's not that difficult, because we do, like, when we get pitches, we do get people who are like, okay, I know this is a good fit for the native. Like, I know that this is a good home for this piece that I'm trying to write, and this is a good home for this story. And I think we've been able to achieve that, like you said, like just going this step beyond most, and just like actually, digging deep, like what are we trying to actually get across? Like, what is the message of this piece? Like, who are we speaking to? And it's just a matter of staying true to ourselves, such that people just know us for this thing, and that's what's expected from our audience and from people who pitch to us as well.
I think like a follow-up to that would then be, do you then find, and this is also for you, Joke, as well, do you then find that, I think something that I kind of experienced is the fact that, another publication elsewhere will do something, but to get that same level of attention, to get that same level of virality, or to get the same level of like audience trust, you have to do more. Like, I feel like people, I mean, is there a sense that, when other countries or other places cover our stories, they get more attention than when, from our own audience, than when we do so ourselves? And if you've experienced that, why do you think that is?
I mean, I think it's like bigger publications who have been around for way longer just have more clout and more visibility. So naturally, that's just what happens. But I think that I feel like, well, as a consumer, like when I'm looking at other publications, there's certain things, like I'll go to say the fader for something different to what I'm looking for on Complex. So I think they're just like, people have that. So there's certain things that will do really, really well on the native that might not do as well on another publication. So I feel like that's one point, like people have their own niche, and like it's just in general, I think it's just a function of just having bigger publications, and like a bigger publication will get more attention. Even with bigger publications here in Nigeria do tend to get more attention about things that we have more authority on, as like a smaller, younger publication. So I think it's just more about longevity and, I guess, how many followers you have.
No, I mean it's a very strong. I mean, that's a very necessary and very important like comment to make, that it's not just about the differences in the geographies. It's also just the fact that we do have newer publications, and there's a reason for that, because we've gone through institutional changes that have left us with very, very limited very limited institutions. Like, how many countries can survive colonization, and then all the upheaval that comes with post-independence, to then create a cultural landscape that's able to export itself brilliantly. But that just then takes me to this subject of exporting, and the way in which our cultural like elements and cultural flows move from the continent to the diaspora. And what I'm interested in here is, nowadays there's a lot of discussion around African aesthetics, the African movement. We've had Africa Rising, which people have kind of like reversed on, but there's still this idea that there's a lot of interest in reconnecting with the continent, in thinking about the continent as the future, as the next frontier. And for someone like for someone like Niyi, for example, who is Harlem-based, Nigerian-born, but is known for for using traditional elements in his work. Niyi, I wanted to ask you, what do you feel about what do you think in terms of the role of the diaspora in kind of furthering African cultures? What do you think? What do you think that is? What do you think, like, as somebody who is using a lot of, or relying on a lot of traditional materials, what do you think about the space that you occupy as automatically representing a culture? Do you think you're representing a culture, or do you think that it's just something like a part of a long design process? What do you think?
Well, I think it's both. It can be one part where post-imperial kind of represents a certain aspect of Blackness, but as we all know, Blackness or the diaspora is very vast and it's very multifaceted. So I can't personally be representative, or post-imperial can be like representative of all of that. And then also you add on top of the part that my personal experience I'm putting into post-imperial. What I try to do with post-imperial, I try to make it a platform that is based on a collaborative effort in terms of storytelling. So I don't even look at it as storytelling. It's more like creating mythology. And that's totally different from storytelling. I think with storytelling, it's more about your personal story or you taking control and directing the narrative. Whereas mythology is putting down a set of base set to tell the story and allow people to add on top of that. So it's not your story anymore. It's the story of everybody you're collaborating with. And when I say everybody, I'm not just talking about the people. I'm talking about the process as well and the materials that we work with. So with post-Imperial, those things are very important. When I work with my fabrics, I don't even say I'm working with my fabrics. I say I'm collaborating with them, right? Because it's also part of a way of assessing different practices that come from the diaspora, like animism, right? So we look at our fabrics and we say that there's a spirit in the fabrics, even the buttons that we work with. So we are very, very conscious on the different fabrications that we work with and how we treat them, right? And so we don't waste anything. We try to use everything as much as possible. And that's just one aspect. But the mythology part is so important for me because everybody has a role to play in that. And it comes from a place where the story now becomes embodied in whoever participates, right? And you don't have to, like, when you want to learn about something, you have to go read it. It stems from the different ways that humans take in information. There are cultures who actually focus on more written word in terms of information, which there are pros and cons to that, right? With the pros is that you can document the history very like detailed. The cons for that is that they create a hierarchy where there are people who are gatekeepers to that source, right? So the people don't necessarily have contact to the story. They have to go to those gatekeepers to get the source. Whereas,
so let me bring in. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You want? Okay.
Yeah. So okay, let me just finish. So the oral, right, is different in the sense that with oral, it might not be directly accurate, right? But there are lessons that they are trying to take from you, so they don't care about the accuracy. So, for example, when someone is telling mythology, or like, let's focus on Yoruba mythology. If they're talking about like Shango coming down to earth, one person might say Shango came down to earth as a chicken. Another person might say Shango came down to earth as a rat. Another person might say Shango came down to earth as a dog. When someone who's used to written narratives hears the story, he's going to see plot holes because it's like, did he come as a dog or did he come as this? But the most important part of it is that Shango came down to earth. That's what you need to take that from it, right? Everybody has, in that case, now what happens is that everybody has participated in the story and they have gotten the part of the story. And this is the reason why when you look at the diaspora, no matter whether people went through the Middle Passage or they went through immigration, there's something that's still embedded and embodied in those people. And it's because they partook in oral, the oral part of information. So it's in them, they practiced it. We are the textbook, right? And so that's what I try to do with post-Imperial. That's why I said mythology is very important for me. So it's taking these different things and trying to create something that is distinctively African, but not trying to create an African canon. I feel like right now, and I think for forever in my whole life, I'm going to be going through this decolonization process because, I mean, I've been trying to practice decolonization for about like maybe 3 or 4 years, but because I now know better, does not mean that I'm not set in my ways in certain things. And I think all of us, to a certain degree, whether we are woke or whether we are in Africa or in wherever part of the world, we all have been affected by colonization, colonialism, right? And we all have things that we do that we see things from a colonial lens. And so what we have to learn like every day to reverse those types of things. And it's not to say that we throw away those things. It's basically saying that like right now, our relationship with those systems are abusive. So we need to cut it off, right? And then when we are self-reliant on ourselves, we can now come back and revisit those things, right? Because humanity is messy, right?
I totally agree. And let me just quickly bring in Irene, because you mentioned something. I've taken like a lot of notes from what you said, from decolonization, and I really want to touch on those. But before that, I want to bring in Irene, because you mentioned something about collaboration and this idea of collaboration as something that's supposed to be like very productive, as something that's supposed to be something as a representative idea. And Irene is someone who has been doing a lot of collaboration. She has a brand that's based in London, and yet showed at Lagos Fashion Week in 2018. which for me already, like, it's something that's kind of, it's not necessarily the story that you expect. And I wanted to just ask you, Irene, about that. Why that kind of, why that platform? You built a brand that was meant to kind of appeal, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to a Western audience, and yet, you're showcasing this at Lagos Fashion Week. What does that move? What was the thinking, in that move, and what did that move kind of signify about your brand, or about your vision for your brand? Well, I think, yeah, sorry.
Classic fail, I was on mute. I think TTYA stands for taller than your average. And I think one thing about the brand that's always stood out anyway is that you can see me through my brand. Everything, the ethos about it, the aesthetic about it, like my whole brand is a representation, and kind of the ethos around it is an excluded girl who's always felt like she never had a space in the fashion narrative. So I think for me, being 5'11", I always felt like I was always wearing men's streetwear. I didn't really feel like it was very feminine. There wasn't a feminine space for me. I never had like your basic wardrobe essentials that fit. And I think when I first started the brand, it was always about just having a space to belong, and then as the brand kind of evolved, I started to question myself, well, where do I belong? What does that narrative mean to me? And I think one thing about being in the diaspora is that, yes, we're in the Western world, but I guess our heritage has always been, my heritage anyway, has always been Nigeria. So that has impacted a lot of what has made me who I am in my work ethic and how I've put that into my brand. So when I first, it was actually Stephen who took me first to the mainland and took me to the dyeing pits, the women that worked in the dyeing pits in Nigeria, because I was kind of exploring the traditional Nigerian dyeing techniques. And Stephen actually took me to the mainland and first introduced me to the women that worked at the dyeing pits. And I had done some stuff for Nike at the time, and we had just for homecoming for friends and family, we'd test run some like using the traditional dyeing techniques and just gifted it out to the friends and family. And I was just like, how do I explore this conversation a bit more in like, okay, this is my heritage, but this is where I live, and how do I merge both of those worlds? So kind of showcasing at Lagos Fashion Week was, one, my dad lives in Nigeria. So for me, it was almost a bit like, you have that kind of, being in the creative space as a Nigerian is actually quite difficult as well. And it was also exploring that conversation. A lot of our parents who have moved from their homeland into the Western world, come here as a way for a better life, So in their eyes, academics is the way forward, you have to be a lawyer. When you want to be a fashion designer, they're like, fashion who? Like, it doesn't add up for them, So I think it was exploring all of those narratives. And I think for years, my dad's kind of seen me kind of doing a bit of higgy haga, but not really understood fully what it is that I'm doing. So when I showed at Lagos Fashion Week, it was a kind of way to like unify. It was really weird because I'd shot my previous lookbook for ASOS actually in Nigeria way before a year before I showed at Lagos Fashion Week. I shot my ASOS lookbook. So, that already started introducing it into the press narrative here in that, okay, cool, I'm stocked on ASOS, but I'm a British-born Nigerian. I've shot my lookbook in Nigeria. I've worked with an all-female team in Nigeria, which, can be actually quite difficult to do. But, from production to, hair, makeup, worked on a full female team. So that was introduced into the media narrative for me. And I thought, well, actually, rather than it just be forward facing, how do I incorporate more of the traditions, more of who I am as who I've grown up to be into my design, into my artwork? So that's kind of what happened basically. And, I used the women at the dyeing pits. We dyed loads of fabrics. We were able to, work on classic heritage patterns and designs, but incorporating that into more Western styles, which was amazing for me. Beyonce bought loads of my collection straight from the runway, which was, again, for me, which was really actually fundamental in the fact that, understanding that the global eye was on Nigeria at that time. And then that kind of translated into me being like, well, okay, how do I continue that narrative? And I feel like a lot of the stuff that you guys have been saying is really important. But I think one thing that we have been able to do is that there's a sense of authenticity in our work, how that's communicated, how that's platformed. And, like going back to what Stephen was saying, in that having some of that power to be able to dictate what it is that you want to communicate, not necessarily what should be imposed in you. So here they're always so quick to be like, oh, British-born Nigerian designers, like you have to fit in this bracket, you know, where. Yeah. So it was like, okay, well, where do I fit? You know, I've grown up in a Nigerian household. Yes, I live in the UK, but what is my story as Irene, as TTYA? You know, no, I don't want to be pigeonholed in this block. So I think it was important to kind of have my own story, but also be able to show to my family as well, like, and even take a lot of my London friends came to Nigeria for that show and to help and to explore it because they've always wanted to see it. So it was really about like, how do we intersect those cultural narratives and how do I make it happen in an authentic way?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely like, what you've mentioned is a very, very interesting, it's a very interesting story. It's a very interesting story about a brand. And something that really jumped out to me is, these ideas of heritage and cultural connection and cultural intersections, which aren't always very easy. I mean, some of the criticisms that, that have been moving around on the continent, include these ideas that, we didn't always, Africa wasn't always, on brand. I mean, it was to I guess if you're talking about Africa, the safari, Africa, the land with no people, that was always on brand. But the idea that African culture is something that was valuable, was never really something that that happened until, at least from the West, until recently. We've always valued obviously our own culture, and so there's a lot of criticism when a lot of people from the diaspora start to get engaged in these conversations. And I was wondering, from your own perspective, have you experienced any such, do you have experience of any such criticism? Have you, or do you have kind of, how do you approach or how do you interpret those types of criticisms where people are kind of like, well, you haven't lived here, you haven't yeah, you're based in the UK, but you're also based in Nigeria, but you have some sort of like passport privilege. How do you kind of, engage with those types of criticisms in your work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually, because I encountered that quite a lot when I came over to do Fashion Week. It was almost a bit like, well, she's the Western girl, she has money, so we're going to put her last. And, just like, not really, it was always this, I found like it was weird because it was almost like you didn't really fit into that space. So, yeah. Here in the UK, it's, oh, go back to your country, go back to where you came from. When you go back to where you came from, it's always this like, oh, well, she's Western, they're not really Nigerian, So it's weird because you kind of fit in, and I always call it Narnia, which I love anyway, because it's, you fit in this weird space. And I think for me, it was about like, how do I connect more? Like, no, I don't live in Nigeria, no, I don't have, I'm not faced with the kind of day-to-day pressures and struggles, but it's also, there's a lot of similarities. Like being a new designer, it's the same thing. Everybody's hustling, everyone's, trying to get their pieces shown. Everybody's trying to like make a name for their brand. So there's a lot of similarities. So I think for me, it was just like, I didn't want to concentrate too much, but also like understanding that maybe I do have a little bit of an advantage because, I have come maybe from the West, but then there's also things that I have a disadvantage of still that I'm still learning, So I think for me, it was just like understanding where what my lane is or where my lane is and just being comfortable in that space. Again, not trying to be boxed in, just kind of accepting things for how it was and kind of navigating my way through. And, Lagos Fashion Week for me was extremely challenging. It was the longest time that I'd spent in Lagos in one go. Like I was there for almost 3 weeks. Yeah. And like in one time working, not just having fun or being on coming in December and having a good time. But I think for me it was really important to like I made so many friends for life. And like so many people in this conversation, in this chat right now have helped. Like I was calling Joke, can you help me with the sampling? Like there was just so much having that network as well of people who are also so willing to help. And I thought like that was so amazing for me. Like Stephen, helping me shoot, and like Joke helping me like with sourcing, and oh, I need this or I need that. So just having that network as well of people who wanted to help you was really important. And that doesn't necessarily get shown. Obviously, everyone always sees the end product of you dancing down the catwalk and everything being amazing, but there's so much hard work, and I feel like we share that no matter where you are. That kind of graft, that kind of hustle is something that's, especially in Nigerians, no matter where you are in the world, that hustle is something that's really installed in us. So I feel like as much as there's a lot of separation, there's also a lot of we're very similar.
So I was just gonna say, like, then so then do you find that what is missing is some sort of like conversation that bridges? And I think obviously this is what makes platforms like this very important. The fact that a lot of people that you may have encountered in Lagos still don't understand the context that you were operating in the UK. I mean, you're a Black woman who is trying to make a name for herself in the fashion industry. It's not an easy thing. So how do you, I mean, what in your own like opinion is kind of like the model way forward? How do you think we bridge that conversation with people knowing, you know, that you're not just coming from a place of, you know, complete privilege. There are still issues where where you're as someone who's based in the UK. You know, do you find that it's more dialogue? Is it more collaboration? I mean, you've done a lot of work with Afrobeats musicians. Do you find that collaborations like that help have those conversations or help make, you know, those conversations happen?
Yeah, definitely. I do feel like exploring collaborations is a really good way to be able to spread the message and spread it in a mass way. So from working with Wizkid to, you know, to Tiwa Savage, and then like coming back and collaborating with Nigerian designer Tokyo James was really important for me, because then that way I could tell the story that I wanted to tell, but in a really authentic way. And I feel like allowing spaces like Homecoming have actually allowed us to be able to spread the message as well, and, you know, unifying and understanding that being a creative intersects on so many ways, through art, through music, through fashion, and how all of those elements are interlinked, you know. So I always kind of say that music is kind of the driving bus, is like the wheels of the bus basically to keep it moving, and then fashion's like the conductor of the bus that's guiding us into where we're going, and then photography and everything is layered on top of that. So I think now all of those arts, umbrellas of art, are all intersected with each other. I feel like that's a way that we can continue to collaborate and work with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, I think those are very, very, you know, those are very solid points. And, you know, someone I kind of want to, it also just brings to mind, you know, still on this topic of collaboration, still on this topic of heritage and, you know, conversation, you know, Tremaine, your work, you know, has, you know, you've done a lot of really interesting work with the idea of Pan-Africanism, with the idea of the Pan-African flag, thinking about, you know, the flag inspired by Marcus Garvey, for example. And, you know, what I was wondering was you know, we live in a time at the moment where, you know, there's a lot of like anti-Blackness going on. And of course, like the only form of response that we can have is kind of like, you know, coming together and really, really thinking and really being there for ourselves. And I was wondering, you know, what, you know, when you produce work that's, you know, that's based on this idea of Pan-Africanism, what are you imagining? What are you seeing about, you know, about a kind of global Blackness? You know, what is your imagination?
My imagination is that connecting African Americans back to Africa. You know, I'm 39, so the era I grew up in, there was almost, I mean, I had a connection from my father traveling to Africa for work a couple times, South Africa, and him bringing back stuff and footage because he's a retired TV news cameraman. But for the most part, growing up in Jamaica, Queens, there was no connection. You know, a lot of the pro-Black stuff that maybe you saw in the early 80s or 90s died out by the time my era, you know, my generation was coming. So I grew up with that in my mind, and a lot of the stuff I design and make, and whether it's art or a T-shirt, is to instill self-confidence in African Americans to come from. You know, that's one of the main things I'm doing is you know. And I've been to Africa 3 times, twice to Lagos, once to Uganda. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even just by documenting those experiences on my Instagram or talking about them with people, there's power in that. Yeah, it's just like there is a physical and esoteric for Black people who are you know, obviously Africa's victims of colonization, but African Americans are victims of slavery and being brought from Africa to America, and just connecting them in a spiritual, esoteric way, in a direct way, like you can go back there, whether it's to visit or otherwise, and you can go there even without a passport. You can go there with a T-shirt. You can go there with food. You can go there with a movie you watch. You know, you can watch the movie Hyenas about, you know, about a whole story of Senegal, and just really showing the whole diaspora and the whole range of emotions, the range of art, the range of everything, because the view of Africa and America is very myopic, very small, very dogmatic of what Africa is, what African people are, what they look like, what they sound like, what they talk like, everything. So there's a lot of education that's needed there. So I'm just trying to do my part in educating myself and presenting that. And also I grew up seeing going to the MoMA and you see Picasso, and then you learn like, oh, Cubism is all from Africa. So that's a big part of my thing too, is showing like all these things that are heralded in Western culture, or whether it's American or British or whatever. A lot of these things that are heralded in they were appropriated or taken from us, and that's another big part of what I'm trying to do. A funny story is my friend Asai. We were in LA,
Yeah.
and he came across in masks, statues, and all kinds of stuff. White guy, and American. So Asai's like, let's go to this place and check this stuff out. So we go to this place, and he comes out, lets us in, and he's got on like a cool pair of like moccasins. I'm like, where are those from? He's like, oh, they're Japanese. I said, oh, you bought them online? He's like, nah. When I go to Japan once a year, and I pick them up, whatever. So then I go, how often do you go to Africa? Since he had children, African, masks and statues and all kinds of stuff. He goes, no, I don't go there. It's too dangerous. I have people to go for me. And this is a guy selling A-side's Nigerian. I'm African American. This is a white guy selling us trying to sell us basically our culture back, our art back. And he thinks it's too dangerous to go. So that's what I'm fighting against. Yeah. And trying to tell. That's the real story. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So that's definitely, that's a very powerful, that's a very powerful mission. You mentioned, that in the those TV pro-black TV shows or pro-black media that were present in the 80s had kind of just like disappeared. Post the 80s, they disappeared. And I wanted to get your thoughts. Why do you think that happened? Why do you think, the explosion of pro-black media? Because it's something like, there were all these TV shows. There was this connection that was there that was very diverse, very, very, I guess, when you look at it from the perspective of, looking at the continent and I guess, and the world, why do you think that disconnect happened? Why do you think it comes from?
Several things. In America, it was a mixture of the white gaze, and just like blacks. It all trickles down from capitalism, colonial and capitalism, they're hand in hand. Just black people valuing what they saw on the cover of Vogue more than what they saw on the cover of Ebony. Black people valuing just all the power structures that were established by, white male patriarchy, and that's valuing those things. And then a mixture of like, post, it's really the 70s, civil rights movement, blacks kind of were like, well, we made it a little far. I can get a job here. I can do this. I'm done fighting. And these are all that's collateral. So some of the collateral damage of us becoming complacent with what we gained during the first, the civil rights movement in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of the collateral damage is like the lack of us continuing to discover ourselves and us finding validation in white values. That's just something that we're till today, in so many ways, where it's just like, the highest honor is getting an Oscar or Emmy award. What about our own award? So that's why it's interesting to see you guys talk. Because comes a point, and this is for myself included, we got to stop thinking about being in Vogue or the New York Times. Times is all right. All these media establishments that are on seeing as the highest level for Black people, African people, being told, winning some type of award or being honored in their colleges, whether it's Oxford or Harvard or Yale, as that the highest thing for us? And what are we creating from the ground up that's owned by Black people, supports all people though, but we build. And then that should be the highest validation, and that's how I see. So I answered the question, but then I'm like, well, what's after the question is the highest validation coming from us, the Black gays, and or the gays are just gays of Black women, that.
Let me ask, and this is for the audience. I wanted to ask, is the Black gaze always redeeming? Is it always automatically like the solution, or does the Black gaze have some learning to do as well? Is it always redeeming? Is it always the solution to the white gaze? Did you guys get that?
No, I don't.
No.
Yeah, I don't think.
So what are
your question? Can we answer? Or?
Oh yeah, sure. I just thought you didn't hear me. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't think any gaze is better than like having Black people fetishize African things does not make it better than white people fetishizing it. You're still fetishizing it. It becomes something that it becomes commoditized. It's like saying that if Black people practice problematic capitalism, it's going to be better than white people. If the system is propagated to oppress, fetishize, and dehumanize people, then it doesn't matter who's in face. All you just done when you put a Black person in there or a woman is you just put a Black face or brown face or nothing. That's it. So we have to be very mindful when we're trying to create these new systems that we're talking about. And these new Black futures that we talk about, not to say that we want to mimic an equivalent of these white structures, or say that we want or start fetishizing like Black billionaires because we think that is what is going to get us a seat at the table. We need to be very, very mindful about those things and say like, hey, perhaps, and this is why I say the decolonization process is very, very important going forward. I'm not saying that we want to sit at the table because not to say that the seat at the table is not a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It's not bad. The problem is that it becomes the dominant thing that it becomes something that like, if we don't get it, we feel like we can't move. And for me, my motto that my uncle has always told me is go with the goers, right? I'm all about just creating alternative timelines, alternative means that can work for all of us. Some people want to stay in this timeline, that's fine. Others want to create something else, and that's fine. And we should be able to give those people spaces to be able to operate and create in that kind of timeline. So the idea of I'm happy to see many people within the diaspora being open to communicating and reconnecting with Africa. But I think we have to be very, very careful how these new systems that we're trying to create or these new relationships we're fostering are the exchanges that we're getting, right? It's not something that it should become something to validate the feelings of someone else from the diaspora to make them feel better while you are dehumanizing or fetishizing somebody else. Right? Once you do that, then what's the point, right? There has to be some means of ethics that we have to start to create when we're doing these types of things. And so when we talk about the creative aspect, this is why I harp on collaboration as a big thing, right? We have to collaborate together. We have to be able to create together. It has to be something where everybody is working in a way to build and add to the story. Not to say that, this culture is much more important than this culture in Africa because they had kings or they have big military might, or that because white people are so obsessed with Egypt, that is the only that's the only civilization in Africa we all want to focus on, right? And then also, I think in terms of decolonization, we have to start looking at things that like, do we need to like fetishize kings? Do we need to fetishize like those kind of like oppressive structural powers? Like, I'm sorry, I'm going to curse, but why the fuck do we care about Mala Musa being such a like the most richest person in the world? I mean, he did some good things, but he, on his way to placing a lot of like high structures, he enslaved a lot of people for the name of Islam. So like for me, like those are things that I'm thinking that for us, we need to really, really sit down and say like, what are the things that we need to do to move on without trying to get into the same traps that the West has gotten into.
Exactly. Yagazi, did you want to add something? Did you want to add something to this?
Not anymore. That was entirely well said and summarized. That's it. Yeah.
No,
So I saw a lot of.
Yeah, I want to
add
well,
something.
just in terms of, I guess one of those ways is our ideas about what success when we're pushing the visual identity discourse forward. So when we talk about, oh, this picture was on the cover of Time, or this picture was on the cover of Vogue, and that's our idea of what success looks like from the African gaze. So when we're talking about, oh, someone has done something fantastic, and we within our own culture are not appreciating it, we're not using it as one of, as me was saying, how we're creating mythology. We're saying until it gets to the global stage, it doesn't really count. It's not a measure of success. So in what we're doing and what we're talking, I think even within that structure, how are we going to make this happen? It almost sounds like we're constantly making this mistake of saying, how are we going to present it to someone else, someone who's not us, someone who's trying to use culture for a temporary period. So it's like moving completely away from that narrative to saying, look, let's normalize that African visual identity is ours, and we're just normalizing how we talk about it. We're not making something sound exotic to make something sound too ordinary. Everything should be ordinary. When I'm talking to Irene about her creative process, I'm just talking about creativity. I shouldn't talk to her like, oh, so, because I'm from Africa, this is the thing I'm doing. And she's saying, because I'm from London, this is how I'm talking about it. We're just talking about different experiences and sharing ideas. So that part of what Niyi was saying about decolonizing, it's this idea of our measures of success being around financial terms and also like global adoration.
And then also in terms of like when we talk about narrative, right? Like you think about it, when we talk about like narrative, a lot of times when we the way we frame it, it feels very individualistic. It's centered around our ego, right? And I think we need to get away from that. And that's why I really, really harp on mythology, because it's something everyone can participate in. And it's not about you anymore. Post-Imperial is not about me, right? It's about all the different people I work with, from the dyers that I work with, to the people who manufacture my stuff in Kenya, to even the clothing, even the fabrics, like all of it is all about this village that I've created, right? And all this platform that I've created. But no, that this platform that it has been created to produce these things, right, that have some sort of purpose within this world. And it's not about my story or what like we need to, like, it's not about creating this narrative thing. For me, it when you do that, it becomes some sort of selfish gain or some sort of selfish ploy for you to position yourself as a power player, right, or an ego trip, right? So I think there's a lot of ego that we need to kill in order for us to move on.
But let me ask this. It's a very interesting thing for us to be having a discussion about, individualism, because, we, in terms of historically, a lot of African creative work wasn't individual. It was very much a communal thing. We don't know who the artists of most of what has been described as art. I mean, we didn't even use those terms to describe those objects. So I wanted to ask, aren't we already like co-opted in this system already? Aren't we already like by default, pigeonholed into this space where we must be individual about our work?
But do we have to? I mean, that's what we feel like we have to do, but I don't think we have to. It's like people saying that, we have to practice capitalism because that's what we are. But capitalism didn't start from it wasn't here from the beginning of the world since we existed, right? So it obviously will have an end. So individualism is not something that, like you said, has always existed in the timeline of the African movement or African culture. So it can have an end if we want it to, right? So it's up to us to decide like how we want to operate. Now, some people, I don't have a problem with individualism, right? What the issue again is that it's too dominant. There's no balance, right? Not saying that all of us need to have this kind of because also doing the collective idea, there's a loss of your own voice that can happen in that too.
Yes,
that's the cons for that. But there has to be a balance. There's no balance, right? If everybody is trying to get that 15 seconds of fame, especially with now social media and everything is so heightened, so everybody feels like they're important. Everybody sees themselves as a brand. If you're not just you're not just accommodating yourself, but you're not trying to do it to other cultures and for everything that you do. Like going to the bathroom is a brand, right? Like you know.
Sorry, Niyi, I was just like hammering off yours in terms of like everybody trying to position themselves, and I think this is something that we've seen recently as I want to be an authority. You know, and when you like positioning themselves that way, they're making themselves gatekeepers. You know, so now, and the way I put it, and it's a very raw way of putting it, is I'm just like every colonial master, there's a tribal chief, and for me that. I mean, it's a very unrefined way of putting it, raw. That's where I put it because it could be broken down more. But that is the position people are going in, and I think that we should be against that. You know, I think of course we also should be careful with saying that we ultimately do this for all, because personally I'm not completely altruistic. You know, part of my work is part of, you know, a simplified form of survival. And how I interpret my work. So what I do it, for lack of better phrasing, I do it for survival because it's the way I live. And I'm not talking in terms of monetary gain or value, but it's truly the way I live, you know, and it just so happens that the way I live is by interacting with people, is by sharing with people, by collaborating with people, and more importantly, it's by passing it on and passing it out. And a lot of people within our spaces want to withhold. They want to be that person that you go to and say, hey, you know everybody in Africa or in Lagos, right? This is like us, you know, and that's where we fail. And that's where
I agree with that. Yeah, so that's why I said there has to be a balance. It's not about just like the collective. You know, your individuality also counts, right? Like those things are all important. It's just all I'm just saying is that there has to be a balance to that. There has to be a balance to like the negative and the positive, yourself and your shadow self, like everything. It can't be a dominant part. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like this conversation because it gets us thinking. It gets us thinking about the future. And so, one of the things I kind of just resting with the question I was thinking is, can you actually, I mean, based on this conversation, is it possible to be representative of the continent? What does that actually mean? When we ask that work should be representative of Africa, what does that mean? You know, in 2020, is this something that we should still be talking about?
You echoed a lot.
Yeah, we couldn't hear the question.
We'll go all on mute.
Okay, so what I was saying was,
You're still echoing, Wale, you're still echoing.
I'm still like, wow.
Let's all go on mute.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it still echoing? I'm just going to go by your facial thing. It's still echoing. Jeez. Wow. I'm getting so technical, man. Can you hear me now? Is it better now? No. Wow.
We can make what you're saying if you're talking maybe a little bit slower. That's why the echo.
Okay. So in 2020, should we still be talking about representation? Is representation an outdated demand? As African artists, is representation an outdated demand? In 2020, should we still be talking about representation?
Unfortunately, yes. Wow, am I echoing now? Unfortunately, yes. Just because representation, despite it being a rampant word or overused, it's just not enough. And it's not just also with Western versus African, but we also see it with gender in particular as well, if we're looking at the continent. So there's still a lot of work to be done. That's it. I think that's the simple answer, is that it's a worn out word, but it's not an action that's done enough. That's it.
Stephen, do you want to add to that? As someone who does a lot of work,
I think it,
we lost him there. Okay, he's back.
Can you hear
I
me?
think we lost you for a second. Do you want to add to that?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I switched to an iPad because like my laptop was. So I was saying, when it comes to representation, there's still like the word itself fair of parts that needs to be represented. So like representation shouldn't just carry like white versus black. There's like the LGBT community. There's like like this conversation that needs to be included. So like so it shouldn't just be like oh, this is how, or this is the standard of representation. So I think it needs to be broken down to proper way of representing.
I'm not sure. I definitely think representation is still important. Unfortunately, like Yagete said, we're just in that space where we haven't reached this point where everybody is able to represent themselves or even have full knowledge of what they're encountering or what they're engaging with, to be able to say, yes, I know absolutely how to engage in all the spaces that are presented to me. And I don't even mean that in a global way, like I keep saying, even within our spaces, is that we're here having this conversation, but most of us are having this conversation as people who have engaged with on larger scales, we have so much experience that we can come here and now say, based on our experience, this is what we think should be happening. But what about creatives and artists that are just starting their journey? You don't want them to go through the entire your own experience and all the ups and downs. It's like, what are we creating to ensure that they don't have to take another 10 years to come to a platform like this and say, what should we do next? How should we engage in the spaces that we want to, especially within Africa or within Nigeria? And this is my biggest issue, is that I'm tired of telling people on a global scale or consumers on a global scale how they should consume our work when we are still continuing to produce that type of work. And it's like nobody is educating, we're not re-educating ourselves, we're not passing down that knowledge enough for us to be able to say, hey, listen, that idea that you have about this is the only way somebody wants to consume African fashion, forget that. It doesn't have to be this way, it can be any way. What is your experience? Tell me that story. And also tell it to the people around you, tell it to your friends, tell it to Ibadan, tell it to Accra, tell it to Dakar. You don't have to tell it to London or Paris. You can just tell it within your community. This idea of how our trajectory should be, we need to also remove that from the space. So that's where I think representation comes in, is because that idea needs to also be represented. That also forms a subject that we are trying to disseminate to a wider group of people. And so with the work that we're doing now, it's like making sure that that is represented in the work that you're doing, so that when I'm looking at your work, I'm not thinking, oh, that looks so African, or that looks like a nice collaboration that they did to represent what Africa looks like. That is a good piece of work, full stop. These ideas that we need to reshape around the word African or African American, no, not African American, but within that African space, that's what I'm pushing for. That's where my impatience is how do we push to a place where you and I are having a conversation, and the point where we get to at the end of that conversation is, okay, here's the project and here's how we're doing this, and it's going to take 50 years to get there, but this is the first step that we have to take. So yes, representation is still important.
I just wanted to add into what Jockey just said, in that also I feel like it's actually transitioning out of that survival mode into thrival mode. I feel like for so long, especially within the creative space, everybody's trying to survive, everyone's trying to hustle, I just need to it's just that survival mentality. And so even being in the diaspora, we have these conversations quite a lot, is that sometimes where you've seen your parents struggle for so long, they've been hustling, you're just in this survival mainframe of just just surviving. And actually, to thrive, you need to have the key groundwork. You need to understand the business as well, and how you can benefit from the business, not just at being in survival mode constantly. And like, just to add on to what Jockey said as well, is that I definitely believe in this kind of like narrative of passing on the baton. So, you know, in that survival mode, you're always made to feel like, oh, there can only be one. I'm the, like Yagazi said, I'm the gatekeeper. You know, I've had to fight to get here, so I need to be on the top. You know, there's no space for anybody else. But actually, if you flood the gateway, that's the way that we're going to be able to have representation and see more of us. But actually, what that says to the next generation who's looking up to us is, wow, like, okay, I can see people that look like me, that have come from similar backgrounds, that have made it. I can make it too. And I think that's where it comes to passing on the baton. It's not just saying, oh, I got here. It's actually telling the story of how did you get here, so that, like Jockey said, that people are not making the same mistakes, and we're not keep on repeating ourselves. We're actually going to exit that kind of mindset of just surviving.
Maybe you can rephrase this better, because, you know, I've heard it from Jockey, Tremaine, Irene as well, in terms of you know, taking that first step to set the foundation, which without a doubt comes with sacrifice. So even in terms of certain institutions or brands and saying, well, you know what, let's just build our own. You know, when people come from families and a history of survival, you know, how do we now encourage people to make that jump? Because I can definitely see, at least for myself, I have made, you know, that more advantageous jump of like, yes, I'm going to work with X, Y, and Z publication because it will get me further. Because if I don't do it, no one else is going to hire me. I'm not going to be able to feed myself. I'm not going to be able to take care of my family. So I literally have to do this, you know? So more realistically, like, yes, we talk about like, you know, let's start building our own, but who starts grinding the cement, you know, without, you know, and we have leaders in the past who have died in obscurity, and then we dig up their work later and applaud them, you know, and then we start replicating or being inspired from their work. But do we want that for ourselves? So how? Because I don't know. Besides, okay, now that I am in this position and now that I have made the decisions that I have made to take care of myself, now I can give out, you know, now I can do. But a lot of people now behind us will now start making those same decisions, and then we'll end up prolonging the work and impact that we actually want to see on ground.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very important point to make. And that's what also makes that conversation about individualism very, very, you know, it's a very necessary conversation, because it's not as easy as just thinking in a collective sense. People do need to protect their own life and their own legacies. But something that I wanted to ask was, you know, I think an industry that a lot of people look to as a model for something that was like that's self-starting, very self-sufficient, but was able to transform itself is Afrobeat. And, you know, what I wanted to do was speak to Dami a bit on this, you know, as somebody who, you know, is, you know, covering that emergence, that it's not even an emergence anymore, that's thriving community. What do you think other creative spaces can learn from, I guess, from the Afrobeat space, at least in your coverage of its trajectory? What do you think we can all learn?
I think beyond beyond music or anything, I think the most important thing with information dissemination is just staying true to your cause and like what you're doing to begin with. I think that having your identity, knowing exactly who you're like, you know, speaking to, what your audience is, and like just staying on course. I think that's the most important. Like, you can't go wrong doing what you want to do. So I think that's the most like important thing for any creative industry in general. I think for us as like, you know, pop culture website, where we managed to create an interesting niches that we're always just like, we have the like our foundation is bridging underground and mainstream. So you know that when it comes to the native, there's no like everybody gets attention on the native. Like one person doesn't get any more attention than the other person. And I think that's where what's the word? We have like we found our niche and like what people expect from us.
Yeah, and I mean, just still on that topic of Afrobeats, because Niyi, you mentioned something about orality and how orality kind of is a different way of experiencing, African heritage, African culture. And I think that's a part of why Afrobeats has been quite successful is because obviously music is an oral medium, and orality allows us to kind of connect with, with a part of our culture that has existed throughout time. We didn't always use text, but we've always sung. We've always, there are songs that borrow their rhythms from ancient times. So I was wondering, in your vision of like decolonization, is orality in that? Do you have like space for orality in that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's something. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No, you go. I thought so. Sorry, where you go.
Oh, okay.
I mean, for me, with post-Imperial, that's something I'm still trying to figure out. Like, how do we include that into our process and what we do? So it's still a process for me. The way I'm doing it now is I personally talking to as many people as possible about the process of post-Imperial, because I feel like it's much more than just putting it down on paper and for people to read, because it's much more expansive than that. But I think it's something that we should practice a little bit more, because it becomes something much so embodied in you, and you don't even have to think about it for you to express what your story is. You don't have to like reference or go to reference the textbook or whatnot. It's in you, so you get it. So I think it's something that a lot of us would benefit from. And yes, you're right. That's why like Afrobeats has become this big thing. It's because it's a way that we have learned how to communicate. Dancing is also a way we've communicated as well. That's why you see it in almost every Black community in the world uses both mediums to communicate, right? And we're very successful in those two mediums because it's something that it's embedded in us, and it requires some sort of oral. It requires something that like uses your body, to tell a story. So I think those are things that we should explore a little bit more and exercise. We should exploit a little bit more to see how we can exercise telling our stories.
Yeah, I'm just going to note before I move on to a couple of more just final thoughts, that we're going to be answering 5 questions from the audience at the end. But before that, Yagazi, Stephen, if Afrobeats is is the big thing now, is photography the next big thing? Can you hear me?
Okay. All right, I'll go first. Okay, Stephen.
I mean, I think the question is quite like, I mean, I would answer it from how I think about photography as a person. There's been like, amazing, photojournalism, photojournalists, documentary photographers, portrait photographers that, I mean, literally like, most of my generation now kind of, study to, maybe create something similar or something close to it. I would say photography has always been a big thing, but putting it side by side with like a genre of music, I'm not too sure how to respond to that, because like, music, as you know, is like a big part, but I mean the photography as a form of art has always been a big part, because then it reflects what has happened like 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I hope this answer.
Oh, I should actually mention. I should qualify. Like, I should actually qualify that.
Maybe like
I should actually qualify that. Sorry.
Some sort of like, maybe Yagazi has like a fresh or like a different ideas to that. Let me see what she thinks.
No, before I even move.
I mean,
okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that before I move to Yagazi, like photography is also actually a big part of Afrobeats, right? Because it is video, it is the imagery that we see. I just wanted to kind of note that there, so it's not just coming up from. It's not the question that just came from from me. Okay.
Yeah, so I agree for the most part with what Stephen says in terms of photography for as long as it existed unfortunately before it got accessible to Africans as a whole has always been a big thing. But in terms of it being as big in today's day and age next to Afrobeats, I No, and that's only because of access. So when we even look at how people view photos, when we look at how people listen to music, and when people like watch music videos and all this other stuff, I'm sorry, but like when we still look at the number one most popular form of communication is the radio. And Afrobeat is always going to be ahead in that. Like, not to say that, you know, the promise of and the growth of photography and photography by Africans doesn't carry its weight, and I hope will continue to grow in its value of representation of our current affairs and our histories and all that other stuff. But to be as big as Afrobeat, then we'll have to come up with a whole other way of getting it out to literally the millions all at the same time.
No, that's it. I think that's a you know, that's a fair enough. That's a very, very, you know, it's a very good response. Tremaine, I was going to ask, you know, when you think about what comes next in terms of, you know, just this idea of, or rather this reality of global Blackness, do you see, how do we ensure, I think a criticism that a lot of creatives have about just Blackness in general is that we end up having conversations about, you know, the US and the US experience. How do you see, and, you know, we've spoken about, you know, the future of representing Africa, but I think there's also something to be said about the future of representing Africa within conversations about Blackness. And where do you see yourself in that? Where do you see your designs in furthering or within the scope of that conversation? Oh, I think it's muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my designs or art or whatever it may be, it's a footnote. Really, it's about connecting to things that can open up and those connections you're talking about. So my main thing is like, that's why a lot of the stuff I talk about authors and books. Mm-hmm. You know, like even stuff I haven't fully delved into, like let's say the book Flash of Spirit, which is talking about the connection from Yoruba to Afro-Cuban to the African Americans. It's about reading those things and really learning, because end of the day, due to colonialism, due to slavery, the stuff isn't readily available in the education systems, especially in America, about the connections. So then we have to go seek it for ourselves. So that I try to be a bridge to that is connecting Blackness to the origins in Africa, you know, and not just seeing Blackness as Jay-Z, who's great, but you know, or just Fela. Like, we got to stop being so surface level, like Fela, Jay-Z, this, that, and the third, like the authors, and also go to like learning about the tribe. Like I like what Niyi said about stop caring about like Egypt and like these kings. Let's go into like what we were as a tribal people, because I feel that was like maybe at the most pure before, because like you said, colonialism happened, and then Africans or African Americans that were left in charge, we just kind of copied the master. And there's this feminist writer who says you can't destroy the master's house by using the same tools they used to build that house. So we have we have to through reading, education, self-education, and digging deep, not surface level shit, and to establish these connections. You know, not just be thinking, oh, I listen to Fela and Wizkid, I'm connected to Africa. That's not it. You know, that's like saying you listen to Bob Marley and you're connected to Jamaica. There's so much more. There's so many layers to it. So it's really about, I try to through the guise of art, pop art, whatever, get people to connect to certain sources, and then they can delve in deeper. So it's not really about me. I'm just trying to be a bridge, you know, because it's, you know, it's so nuanced, understanding the connections and building the connection.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take some questions. Let's take some questions from the audience. So we have. Do you think there should be a differentiation in identity between being Black globally or being from the African diaspora? Does this matter? If so, why? And how can this narrative change? So I think maybe, I'm going to ask this to, let's see, I'm going to ask this to Niyi. What do you think? Do you think there should be a differentiation in identity between being Black globally or being from the African diaspora?
I mean, I think from the question, it feels like it's the same thing. I mean, Black globally means that you are connected to the diaspora. The African diaspora, in my opinion, is anyone who has some African roots and is connected to the diaspora. So for me, when I think of the African diaspora, I'm thinking about Black people in Brazil. I'm thinking of African Americans. I'm thinking of Black immigrants in Turkey or wherever it is. To me, if you have roots from the continent, you are in the African diaspora. So I personally, that's how I look at it. I know some other people, they only consider the African diaspora strictly people who are from the continent or like first generation, African immigrants. But for me, I extend it to basically anybody who has roots from the continent.
Irene, what do you think?
I keep doing the classic of being on mute. I think it's a tricky one. I definitely think that, again, there's so many levels to it. And I think it definitely will, it's about kind of just identifying and taking ownership. I don't know if that necessarily means, you kind of, how do I put it? I think, let me rewind, sorry. I think it's just more about ownership now and then passing on the baton and seeing how we kind of move forward in that realm.
So let me just double back on that. So as a young, or rather for a young aspiring designer with, in that context, or a young aspiring designer with big dreams of going global, not just in Africa, what's the first step to take towards, that big dream? What do retailers advise?
I think the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years is that you have to build your direct to consumer. I think it's really, similar to what Tremaine said, in that we feel like we have to be validated by being on these global spaces, on being on these global platforms. But actually now, when you look at what the power of social media has, it gives you the ability to be able to reach your consumers without actually being stocked in all of these so-called stores, So when you look at a girl who can make a lip gloss and can make $1 million from lip gloss on her own platform without it kind of now gives you the opportunity to be like, how do I build my direct to consumer? And even for me at the beginning, a lot of it was, I want to be in this store, I want to be platformed here. And you kind of felt like, well, if I was in the creme de la creme, then people will see my brand more. When actually, if I invested more of that time in building my direct to consumer, then I'm responsible for my own narrative. I'm responsible for my own customer base. And then I'm not being, because people feel like by getting your supply, being stocked in a brand, that's like the be all and end all. But actually, what I've learned is those brands are actually, you're feeding into their narrative of what they want to consume, of who they want to stock, and the story that they're selling. When they're no longer selling that story, your brand is no longer relevant. Yeah. So you always have to make sure that you have your own customer base and work on your own platform, your own website, your own e-com store, just as much as you would platform. And then you can maybe do smaller capsule collections for those stores that you want to be in. But I think for me, the biggest advice I would give is always build your own direct to consumer first.
Joke, you're the creative director of a Lagos-based brand. Gray, what do you think about that? What would your advice be to a young designer?
I mean, if they're in Nigeria, from my own experience, I think the first lesson to start teaching is to try and find your consumer within the continent and within the country, because it's an idea, right, that for you to go global is the idea of success. And what we're learning more and more is actually that we are our biggest consumers out of the space of trend. And if you want to go global, like expand that idea of what global means beyond, I guess, the UK or the US, look to other spaces. I mean, you and I have this conversation about going to Asia and seeing like where people are appreciative of what you're doing, where you don't have to change the ideas that you're coming up with in order to be able to make those steps. And it's very easy thing to say 10 years into it, to say, oh, don't do that or don't do this, because I understand when you're starting and how big the dream can be. But start local is what I'd say. And as Irene said, online, especially in Nigeria right now, everyone is consuming online. It's our high street at the moment. Instagram is our high street, so start there as well.
Yeah, okay, that's fantastic. There's another question in seeking connection and heritage. What risk is there from what's the risk of homogenization? Is there a danger in us, in this our quest for connection? Is there a danger in losing nuance, identities, outlooks, inspirations, perspectives? We're all in this thing about we need better representation of Africa, but how do we ensure that our own uniqueness? Is there a risk that our own uniqueness gets lost in that? Yagazi, do you have any ideas?
I think the risk is with I don't know. This word is already played out. What's that? How do you pronounce it? The Wakandification of Africa.
Yeah.
I don't know where I read it. But I think, given the platforms, like, yes, there is that danger when you have like various like unique, beautiful like cultures, and not just like, broad cultures, but also like actual traditions and artifacts that are actually lumped into like a movie or whatever the case may be, and now presented to the masses. I think that is the greatest danger. But ultimately, when we are here on ground, or we're inspired from having been on ground and we're working, I don't think that either of us or any of us are working as a way of like, let's just gather everything and pack it and throw it out there. You understand? I think it's a little bit more, not a little bit, but there's a lot more work that goes into it. But ultimately, it's the platform that sometimes carry out these visuals, in which then somebody can say like, wow, I really want to go to Africa because, yeah, I heard Wizkid was cool, or, like, this is how, because of what they showed in Black Panther, this is how they dress. And as simplified as it may be, we still live in an age where people are still asking us the 10-year-old question that we experience coming into school of like, do we hunt, do we run with lions and tigers? So of course, it's funny, it's played out as tired, but like, this is the same messaging that people are getting when we have certain visuals that are pushed out and aren't properly, regardless of the good intentions, without the consumer doing the research like we discussed, can now be taken as a lump sum of this is what everything is, versus it being more self-evident.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very pressing concern. This idea that we all are striving for connection, but how do we then just ensure that our uniqueness is protected? So a final question that we have is, and this one is for, I think it's for everyone, particularly those who are based in Nigeria. It's how can we create a community in Nigeria where the dominant culture is so conservative? Like, how do you create a representative community in Nigeria where the dominant culture is so representative? Do the outliers then become individualists? I think that's what we have right now, but I think the question is basically saying, looking ahead, if we do want to create a community, how do we, and how is that possible, given that Nigeria is such a conservative, or Nigeria has such a conservative culture? Stephen, do you want to try? Do you want to give us your opinions on this?
I think the conservativeness has always been from who bettered us, like who from parents, from family, from the elders, and I think also this time has been geared towards more of like how do we play out to be this freedom, like how do we seek more freedom, so it's really like I wouldn't say it's a fight, but it's like still like a continuous effort to take yourself or challenge yourself away from like it's not staying in the rain, or you can't do some certain things. Or, so like it's like a conscious effort to keep, regaining or learning or relearning and teaching self. And it has to be done with like, so many people. Like the fact that I might be aware or judged like towards like a free mind doesn't mean like my neighbor is. So I think the communication is going to very, very, very like vital here. The more we converse and like talk about it, the more we learn. Just like the same way I do to my mom as well. Like she's like a Kong Christian woman, and we have conversations around like why should this person look this way, and then I'm always like this is this person's life. You need to learn to always on look, or it shouldn't bother you how somebody expresses themselves. So I think conscious like conversation can be helpful.
And Dami, do you have any additional thoughts on this? I mean, Native has been brilliant at carving a space for alternative musicians, the Alte community. What are the lessons? What are the what are the insights from that?
I think like even beyond like the community and like music or whatever, I think it's also very important for us to just make sure that we're always covering like social issues, like things that are happening in Nigeria in a way that like is easily digestible for Nigerians in Nigeria. And I feel like when you have something worthwhile to say, regardless of like what kind of backlash you're getting, people listen. Like when you're saying something that makes sense, like people will listen. And I think that's just so with us, like we're a music publication, but we always just kind of cover everything. Like we'll cover social issues. Like recently we spoke about the like massacres in Kaduna, and it was not like our typical that's what we do on a day-to-day, but we're doing that, and that's like a whole Nigeria, like is a problem for in Nigeria, and everyone in Nigeria wants that information. And so it's just doing more things like that, making sure that even though this is your niche, like you're also then like delivering information in a way that everyone wants to listen. And I feel like that kind of like breaks barriers, and it's like, okay, they're not just music, they're like for like they're for us in general. I think support like that, just like carefully selecting what kind of information we're speaking about is a way to kind of break barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's how you also even validate the people that are in your audience, because they get to know that they're very much a part of this country, and those issues that matter to them also matter to the platform. All right, thank you guys so much for being on this panel with me, and once again, thank you for being so patient with all with all the internet glitches and all of that. It's the times that we're in. I think in other circumstances this would have been probably in person. So thank you guys so much. And I hope that our audience has had a very enriching conversation. The questions were brilliant. The comments have been brilliant to read. And I thank you guys so much. And I also want to thank Homecoming and Brown's Fashion for doing such an amazing job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.